People ask me sometimes what made me stay in Montana. Not just stay in the state, stay in the work. 15 years of watching wolf populations shrink on spreadsheets, of writing reports that nobody in Washington read until they needed a number to argue against you, of driving alone through forests at 2 in the morning, checking signals on a receiver that beeped the same whether the animal was thriving or dying 3 miles away. People ask, and I usually give them the short answer: the mountains, the quiet, the work. But that's not the real answer. The real answer has amber eyes and a coat the color of a winter storm, and it happened on a night in December when I broke every protocol I'd ever taught anyone, climbed down a frozen cliff in the dark, and saved a life I had no business saving. My name is Ethan Callaway. I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in northwestern Montana, Flathead County, and I've been doing this work for going on 17 years now. I specialize in gray wolf population monitoring, which is a precise clinical way of saying that I drive into forests alone at night and try to keep track of animals that don't want to be kept track of, on behalf of a federal agency that has a complicated relationship with actually protecting them. I say that without bitterness, mostly. It's just the truth of the work. By December of 2023, I had become the kind of person who lives on the perimeter of his own life. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to what happened later. My marriage had ended 2 years earlier, and not in any dramatic way. Sarah just packed while I was in the field, which, if I'm being completely fair to her, tracks perfectly. I was always in the field when something important happened at home. She left a note on the kitchen counter, a genuinely kind note, which somehow made it worse to read. I folded it, put it in the drawer under the refrigerator, and went to work the next morning. I kept doing versions of that for 2 years, folding things up, putting them away, going to work. My field diaries from that period have whole months where the only entries are temperature readings and GPS coordinates. No observations, no reflections, just numbers. That tells you everything about where I was. I lived alone in a log cabin 12 miles outside of Whitefish, Montana. No consistent cell signal. A wood stove I fed more out of habit than necessity. A front porch that looked out toward the Whitefish Range, which in December looks like something painted to make you feel small in the right way. I had everything I needed to be fine, and none of what I actually needed to be fine, which is a condition a lot of people in their 40s know well, even if they don't put it in those words. On the night of December 14th, I was running a late monitoring route in the northern sector of Flathead National Forest when the receiver in my truck picked up an anomalous signal from a wolf designated F07 in my records. F07 was a 4-year-old gray wolf, a female from the Swan Lake pack, one of 7 breeding wolves I was actively tracking in the region. I had known her since her 2nd year. I knew her movement patterns the way you know the habits of someone you've shared space with for a long time without really talking. The signal was coming from a rock formation north of the Middle Fork Flathead River, a place the locals call Devil's Ledge, a series of ice-covered granite shelves that drop away toward the river 150 feet below. Wolves don't go there. Too exposed, too dangerous. The temperature that night was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. I pulled over, grabbed my headlamp and my emergency kit, and started climbing. I found her 200 meters above the river and felt my stomach go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air temperature. She had slipped on a sheet of black ice on a narrow shelf and was wedged into a small outcropping below the main ledge. Her hindquarters hanging over nothing, her front paws scratching at granite that offered nothing to grip. 45 pounds of wolf in a bad situation would have been serious enough. But she was pregnant. Visibly, obviously pregnant. Her abdomen distended in a way that shifted her center of gravity forward and down, that made every tiny adjustment toward safety a potential movement toward the wrong side. The river below her was only a sound in the darkness. A low, continuous roar that didn't care about any of this. I stood there for 40 seconds. I counted. The protocol I had taught interns for 10 years is unambiguous about this kind of situation. Observe, document, do not intervene. Natural situations resolve naturally. I believed that. I still believe it in principle. Then F-07 turned her head and looked directly at me. And what I saw in her eyes was not the panic I expected, and not the aggression I was trained to watch for. It was something steady, something attentive, something that I had no professional framework for and couldn't look away from. I went over the edge of that ledge to help her anyway. I used the nylon cord from my emergency kit to create an anchor point in a crack in the rock above the ledge, descended as far as the cord allowed, extended my hands toward her. She growled once, low and short, a warning, and then went completely still while I worked my hands under her rib cage and pulled. The granite opened my palms. I didn't feel it until much later. When she was back on the wide shelf above the drop, she stood, shook the ice and snow from her paws, and looked at me one more time. Then she walked into the darkness of the spruce forest and disappeared without making a sound. I stayed on that ledge for a while. The wind moved down from the peaks, and the river kept going below me, and I had that specific feeling you get sometimes when you've done the only right thing available to you. Not proud, not heroic, just quiet in a way you haven't felt in a long time. I hadn't felt that in years. I didn't know what to do with it. I just stood there in the dark with bleeding hands and let it be what it was. If stories like this say something you needed to hear, subscribe. We put out a new one every week, and I think some of them will find you at exactly the right moment. I didn't file an official report about the intervention. I logged that F-07 had been located in the Devil's Ledge area and appeared healthy. That was accurate. The cord, the descent, the 40 seconds of standing there and counting. I kept those to myself. Looking back, I think I wasn't ready to explain something I didn't understand yet. The weeks that followed were outwardly unchanged. Early mornings, dark roads, the blue glow of the receiver screen in the truck cab, coffee at the cabin at 5:30 a.m. in temperatures that made the log walls crack and pop. I checked F-07's GPS signal more frequently than I checked any of the other collared animals in the region. Not by a dramatic margin, just enough that if I'd been tracking my own behavior, I would have noticed it. I didn't write any of that down. I just kept checking. In January, a blizzard closed the roads for 4 days. I was confined to the cabin with intermittent power, a dwindling stack of firewood, and a laptop with enough battery to read academic papers. I spent one full afternoon working through every published study I could find on individual recognition between large carnivores and humans, on wolf memory and associative learning, on post-rescue behavior in wild predators. I read each paper twice. I told myself it was relevant background research. That was not entirely true. February was when everything shifted in a direction I hadn't anticipated. F-07's GPS collar registered 72 hours of near immobility in a dense patch of forest near a creek tributary on the eastern edge of Swan Lake territory. Denning behavior, unmistakably, which meant she had given birth. I calculated somewhere between 4 and 6 pups based on her size and condition, at last close observation. I drove out before sunrise on a morning when the sky was the pale gray that precedes dawn in Montana, parked 2 miles back, and covered the rest on foot with a long-range camera and a thermos of coffee that went cold before I touched it. I set up 180 meters from the den site and held still for 2 hours. At some point in the second hour, F-07 emerged. She stretched, walked a slow perimeter of the area, lifted her nose to the wind in several directions. Standard post-denning behavior. I watched through the camera lens without breathing particularly well. Then, before she turned back toward the entrance, she stopped. She turned her head with a precision that had nothing random about it, and looked directly at the cluster of fir trees where I was crouched behind a deadfall. Invisible, by any reasonable assessment. She held that position for close to a minute. Then she went back to her pups. I came down the hill with shaking hands, and for once in 4 years, it was not because of the cold. I started writing in my field diary again in March, not as a scientific document, but as something harder to categorize. Part record, part conversation with myself. On one of the first new pages I wrote, "I don't know what I'm doing out here anymore. I know I need to keep going." That's not a scientific observation. It barely makes sense as a sentence, but it was the most honest thing I'd written in 2 years, and it felt like something to build on. Hit that like button if you've ever had an animal see you more clearly than you were seeing yourself, because I was beginning to understand what that actually felt like. April arrived the way bad news does in this work. Not all at once, but steadily. A state legislative proposal opened limited hunting quotas on wolves in 3 northwestern Montana counties with territory overlap into the Swan Lake Pack's range. I drove to Helena and sat in a hearing room for 8 hours presenting population data, movement studies, pack stability analysis. I submitted written comments. I spoke in hallways to people who listened and nodded and did nothing, which is a different thing from disagreeing with you, and a much harder thing to work around. I drove home on a Thursday night and pulled over on Route 2 somewhere north of Hungry Horse, and I sat looking at the Glacier Range silhouette against the night sky for 40 minutes without being able to make myself drive. I had been in that hearing room before, in different forms, many times. I knew how the numbers moved. In May, 2 of the Swan Lake pups were killed on a federal access road at 2 in the morning. Not hunters, not predators. A vehicle in the dark. I received the call at 4 in the morning and drove to the site and collected samples and photographed the scene and filled out the incident form. I did everything the protocol requires, and there's something you can say for protocol. It gives you a procedure when there's nothing useful to do. Then I drove back to the cabin, built up the fire, and didn't leave for 2 days. FO7's signal was active on the receiver the entire time, alive, moving, holding the pack's territory with 4 surviving pups. I checked the signal 3 times a day, morning, noon, before sleep. The way you check on something you can't protect but can't stop watching. I was not watching because I thought it would change anything. I was watching because it was the only thing that week that felt like it mattered. I want to say something honest about that period because it connects directly to what happened in August, and I don't think August makes full sense without it. What I felt in that cabin was not grief exactly, though there was grief inside it. It was closer to a specific exhaustion, the exhaustion of caring about something the systems around you are functionally designed to wear down, year by year, slowly. Being unable to stop caring anyway. I'd been living inside that exhaustion for 15 years, but that May, it was qualitatively different because the professional distance I'd always kept between myself and the work, the buffer that let me write the mortality reports and the policy comments and the incident forms and still go home and sleep, that distance had collapsed on a ledge in December. And now there was a specific wolf, with 4 specific pups, alive and growing, whose existence I had participated in a small and completely unauthorized way. I didn't know what to do with that closeness. I went back to work. What else do you do? Summer in Flathead County has a quality that's difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced it. The way the light comes down through the western passes in early morning, the way the mountains lean toward you. The smell of pine resin and cold water, and something cleaner than anything available in any city I've ever been in. I spent June and July running routine monitoring circuits, attending 2 more agency meetings that produced nothing immediate, and watching the Swan Lake pups grow on camera from a careful distance. They were loud and clumsy and fearless, the way young animals are before they've learned which things are worth fearing. By July, they were moving independently, testing the boundaries of pack territory, beginning to learn their world in a real way. It helped, watching them, more than I would have said at the time. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever had an animal show up in your life at exactly the right moment? when you needed something you didn't have words for yet. I read every one of these, and I think you'd be surprised how many of us have a version of that story. On the morning of August 9th, I had my coffee on the back step of the cabin at 6 in the morning. The sky was the saturated cobalt blue it sometimes reaches in Montana before the full light spreads across it. Deep and clear, the color of cold water in a place nothing has disturbed. Temperature in the low 50s, no wind. I was not thinking about anything specific, which was itself a small and genuine improvement over most of that year. I heard movement in the tree line before I saw anything. Not the heavy, deliberate sound of a bear, not the quick, unpredictable randomness of deer. Something that moved slowly and with direction, like something that knew exactly where it was going and was taking its time arriving. I put the mug down on the step. F-07 stepped out of the trees at 18 meters. I recognized her immediately. The dark gray coat with white patches at the throat, the way she moved, the set of her head that I had been watching through camera lenses and twice in person across 3 years of fieldwork. She stopped at the edge of the open ground and looked at me. And around her, in a loose and unhurried cluster, were 4 pups. Roughly 6 months old, already deeply furred, already more than half her height. They stopped when she stopped. They looked where she looked. 4 pairs of pale yellow eyes and 1 pair of amber, all pointed in my direction, all quiet, all completely calm. I did not move. I did not reach for anything. I stood on the back step of my cabin in the early August light and looked at the 5 of them and looked back, and I tried to find words for what was happening and couldn't find any. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't threatened, wasn't threatening. She wasn't behaving the way a wild wolf behaves near a human structure. No tension, no scanning for a route out. She was simply present, the way you might stand in a doorway with something you made and let someone see it, without asking for a word in response. We stayed like that for nearly 15 minutes. The pups shifted occasionally, bumped into each other with the easy carelessness of animals that feel entirely safe, investigated the edges of the clearing with brief, aimless curiosity. F-07 never looked away from me. At one point, one of the pups drifted a few feet in my direction, and she made a low sound. Not urgent, just a word, in whatever register she uses with her young, and the pup turned around immediately, without drama. Then she turned herself, made that same low sound once in a different cadence, and all 4 pups fell in behind her, and they moved back into the fir trees. In 10 seconds, they were gone. The forest closed over them, and there was only the blue sky and the sound of a creek somewhere back in the timber, and my coffee going cold on the step. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table. The cabin was quiet in that specific mountain country way that has weight to it, that you can feel on your skin. I sat in it for a while, which is not something I was historically good at, and I let the morning be what it was. Then I opened the field diary and found a blank page and wrote, F-07, August, 4 pups, all present, all healthy. She came back. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to stay here and find out. It was the first entry in 15 years that had nothing to do with the work itself. It was about the reason to keep doing it. I have thought about that morning many times since, about what it means when a wild animal, a creature with every evolutionary reason to maintain maximum distance from human beings, chooses to close that distance instead. Not for food, not because she was cornered, not because she needed anything I could provide. There's a version of this story where I say she came to thank me, and maybe there's some truth in that framing. Animals are capable of things we're still working to understand. But I think what she actually brought me was something simpler than gratitude, and in some ways harder to accept. She came to show me it had mattered, that the night on the ledge, the cord, the broken protocol, the 40 seconds of standing there making a choice, all of that had produced something real. 4 animals alive and healthy in the August light, learning the world their mother had kept safe for them to find. There are seasons in this work when you need proof of that. When the hearings go nowhere and the roads take animals in the dark and the policy documents stack up and the years start to feel like the same year on repeat. On those days, you need something you can point at and say, this is why it matters. This is what it looks like when it works. She gave me that. I don't take it lightly, and I haven't forgotten it. I still check her signal every morning. The collar battery is running low. I'll need to recapture her soon to replace it, which means a tranquilizer and a net, and a team, and all the clinical machinery of federal wildlife work. She'll wake up disoriented, and I'll be one of the humans standing over her, and she won't connect me to the man on the ledge in December or the man in the doorway in August. That's fine. She doesn't need to know. I know. And that's enough to get in the truck in the dark and do it again. If this story gave you something to carry, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that what they're doing out there matters, even when it doesn't feel like it. We'll be here next week with another one. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.